When we read the cards, very often the first thing that we're focused on is the people that we see and the characters that we encounter. And that's great because these characters, the people that we see depicted on the cards, are very often reflections of ourselves and reflections of the people around us. We can learn from those characters. And when we perform a reading, we're looking to them to reflect back what's going on in us. But one thing I've learned through the years of working with the tarot is that that's not the only way to work with the cards. I call that a person-centric approach, but what we're going to do today is we're going to take a landscape-centric approach to the tarot and to our reading. We're going to focus on the voyage between the cards, and by doing that, we're going to be paying special attention to what's going on in the background. What I want us to look at is not just the people that are there, but the landscape that they're inhabiting. So, by doing that, what I want to show you is how to use your tarot reading as a map to navigate your personal journey. I think of it this way. Now, you might think I'm crazy, but one of the things that I love doing is actually going onto Google Maps, going into Street View, and literally just dropping the cursor randomly somewhere that I don't know in any country in the world. And then the exciting thing for me is watching some random street in some random town come up on my screen. And then all of a sudden, I've got a window into a world that I never knew existed. Now, think of your tarot deck as we do this workshop as that Google Street View window. Each of these cards has a landscape. Each of these cards is a setting. Each of these cards is a town, a kingdom, a country, a province in itself. Focusing on the background helps us to see a wider picture. Our readings become a journey through the landscapes themselves. Most importantly, the purpose of our journey. First and foremost, when we do a reading, any reading is a leap of faith towards wholeness and completion. That's when we're reading for ourselves. That's when we're reading for somebody else, or if we're reading professionally for a client. Basically, we're bringing our concerns into a reading and we want to move forward into a better place. So, all roads begin with the Fool and they end with the World. When we take the Fool as the beginning of our reading, we're taking that leap of faith. We're jumping into the unknown by allowing ourselves to be challenged by the cards. We are leaping out of our comfort zone. We're stepping off the cliff. We're taking a big risk. That takes us on a journey, but ultimately we want to come to that place of completion. We want to come to that place of fulfillment, and that is encapsulated by the World card. Everything else in our readings is the journey from one to the other, from the Fool to the World. Everything in between is the landscape of our journey, so to speak. So, you can do this with any pictorial tarot deck probably, but for the purposes of today, we're going to be working with the Waite Tarot. Now, anyone who knows me knows that this deck is my passion. You know, I've created lots of my own decks, but crazily enough, whenever I use this is coming home. I've worked with this since I was 13, and I think I probably love it more now than I even did then. Why do I love it so much? The devil is in the detail with the Waite Tarot. When Pamela Coleman Smith and Arthur Edward Waite created this deck, little did they know that it would basically set the template for the majority of what was to come. It's the mother of all modern tarot decks. There is a diversity and a richness of landscapes depicted in this deck, which makes it perfect for the exercises that we're going to be doing. Furthermore, these landscapes show an extraordinary level of continuity, relatedness, and connectedness. So let's take a jump in and let's look at some of the features that we're going to encounter as we journey through these landscapes. Okay, so here we go. The first thing I want us to look at is something very basic, and that's the colour of the sky. Now, you'll see here that I've got 6 cards. Now, these each show the 6 different sky colours that are featured within the Waite Tarot. Each has its own symbolism. So, looking first at the Hermit, the sky colour is a greyish blue, and I take this to mean twilight, liminal space. So in effect, the Hermit is shining his lamp either into the dusk or the dawn. And traditionally, dusk or dawn was seen as a time with a veil between our world and the world of spirit as it is thinnest. So whenever you see this colour sky, you're in that liminal space, you're in that liminal landscape where flashes of insight from the other world or from higher reality are more likely to be accessible to you. Moving on to the 9 of Swords, this is a lot more direct. You can see that the sky, the background is black. And I take that black background to literally mean night. And you can see here that night brings its fair share of anxiety, bad dreams, and fears. But what about the 2 of Wands with its grey sky? Now, literally, a grey sky is the absence of the sun. A grey sky gives a landscape that requires additional or outside illumination, in my eyes. So you see this again on the aces. But ironically, rather than the sun creeping in, the illumination comes from the divine hand and from the suit symbols themselves. So whenever you see a grey sky in the landscape, I see it as unrealized potential or something that requires extra illumination. In this case, the 2 of Wands, it's the card of potential itself. You can see that he's got the earth in his hand, but the sun is yet to come out. What about this yellow sky with the 9 of Pentacles? Now, that's not quite so natural. We don't really see fully yellow skies. We see yellow on the horizon at sunset, but this is something more symbolic. Yellow is the alchemical colour for the element of air. So in this instance, I would suggest that the yellow sky is signifying an environment where we're going into a higher mental or spiritual plane. The yellow sky is a symbol of a place where we will receive enlightenment or we will step into mental clarity. In this case, with the 9 of Pentacles, this is a woman who's reached a level of rational maturity that has allowed her to accumulate riches. You see the yellow sky very notably with the Fool and the Magician, and very much with the Fool, you're in a space of higher reality. He's about to take the plunge into that higher reality. Now the Emperor. This is the only card in the Waite where we see an orange sky. Now, orange is the colour of fire. It's the colour of passion. It's the colour of ferocity. And it's the colour of power. So that's what we're seeing here. The most enigmatic for me is this final one, because it seems quite simple. Pale blue, sky blue, the colour of day, a daytime sunlit sky, a cloudless sky. But it's interesting where this turns up, because we see it on many cards where sometimes we don't even think about this, but it's, it shouldn't be daytime. The star is a very, very specific example of this. Now, logically, you would have expected Waite and Smith to select either the black background or the dark blue background that we see in the Hermit, but no, they've gone with this pale blue. as they did on the moon. So you see the three celestial bodies are all actually in daylight and not in nighttime or liminal space. Interestingly as well, I mean, there are many examples of where this background color denotes literal daylight, but it's interesting to see that here it doesn't. But also you see this pale blue on the High Priestess. So we can interpret this as literal daylight, but then again, it can also be interpreted as illumination within a space that would normally be dark. So that's our basic sky colours. Let's look next. Something more tied specifically to the landscape, cliff edges. Now here's two examples. You can see the Seven of Wands with the warrior standing on the cliff edge, fending back the other six wands, or the Fool about to plunge into his abyss of unknowing. So whenever you see a cliff edge in the landscape, focusing on that as a risk, a radical change. Certainly both of these men are about to face radical changes. In the case of the Seven of Wands, he will either plunge over the cliff into defeat, or he will fight off the opposition, or he will be forced into retreat. The Fool knowingly plunges into new experience, new risks, new life. So what about mountains in the landscape? So here we can see the Hermit again, and we also see the Judgment card. Now, one thing I need to say here is, just as with the last card, the last set of cards, let's look at these landscapes as if they're the same landscape, because in many ways they are. Now, this throws a completely different cast on your reading. What if somewhere in those mountains, beyond the angel, the dead rising, the Hermit is looking down? Can you imagine if you go beyond the frame of the Hermit card and somewhere that Judgment scene is being reenacted? I mean, again, we can see that the sky colours are different here. So I would suggest that we have snapshots of different parts of the same landscape, but at different times of the day. Mountains represent being able to look down from an objective place on what's going on below. So whenever you see mountains in your reading, you know that you can either be in that elevated place or you are in that elevated place. Mountains give us the ability to be objective. Rural landscapes. So you can see here the Four of Cups, the complacent boy being handed a cup by the divine hand. He's already got 3 full cups. He isn't interested. On the right, we can see the Strength Maiden restraining the lion. Now again, is this the same landscape? Is this 2 different snapshots of a similar landscape? In many ways, I think it is. But once again, let's look. The sky colours are different. So on the left, we have a daytime scene. On the right, we're in the same rural landscape, but we have the yellow sky denoting something more abstract. That yellow sky is telling us that we are basically in a higher mental and spiritual plane. But interestingly, let's begin to tie these. You can see the blue mountains in the background. And again, you can see a hint to the left of the Four of Cups that there may also be the foothills of those blue mountains behind the green landscape. Rural landscapes represent natural environments rather than constructed environments. So in this case, I would say we are in the land of instinct. Okay. Let's move on to something related but slightly different. Rather than a rural landscape, we're looking at farmscapes. So in this instance, we have 2 cards from the suit of Pentacles. We have the Knight and we have the 7. So farmscapes, rather than representing the natural, the instinctive, they represent all of our natural resources and potential that are being cultivated. So this is where we take the natural and we maximize its potential. Let's look at gardens. Now here we have the Ace of Pentacles. As I mentioned before, you can see the grey sky, but the illumination is not coming from the sun. The illumination is being introduced in artificially by the divine hand bearing the pentacle. On the right, we have the Lovers with its blue sky. But in both instances, we have cultivated gardens. Now, are these potentially the same garden? I wouldn't be surprised. The same garden in different places. But what we have are created, safe, affirming and uplifting spaces. That's what a garden is. You can see on the left something that looks like an English country garden, but interestingly, there is a pathway leading out to the mountains beyond. To the right, we have the symbolic Garden of Eden with the Tree of Life and the Tree of Knowledge, the lovers presided over by the angel. Is it the same garden? It could possibly be. That gate, as far as we know, in our imaginations, is that the gate that Adam and Eve were cast out of? Is it the gate where the angel with the flaming sword was stood once they'd been expelled? Could be. We don't know. The great thing with tarot is that we can use our imagination and we can make the most of our imagination and make intuitive connections with these cards. And the Magician, again. You can see the same vegetation in the Magician as you saw in the garden of the Ace of Pentacles. Same garden? Could well be. Vegetation and flowers are important. It's been called the language of flowers. You can see on the left we have roses and lilies representing passion and purity. On the right, you can see peeping over the walls of the garden in the sun card are 4 sunflowers. It's been said that these sunflowers reflect the light of the sun, but they also are a representation of the 4 elements, the 4 directions. Each plant or each bloom is symbolic and brings meaning into your reading. Now, this is an interesting one. Land, water, or in between. And you can see on the left, we've got the playful battle of the 5 of Wands on land. To the right, we have the sea voyage of the 6 of Swords. But in the middle, we've got the 8 of Swords. Half in, half out. It's coastline. You can see the tide is half in, half out. There are pools of water, soft ground, and then hints of the sea or a lake beyond. It's liminal space. So, to the left, you're on solid ground. To the right, with the 6 of Swords, you're in the realms of the emotions. You're moving, you're in fluid motion. In the middle, this bound woman of the 8 of Swords is half in, half out. She's between the solid realm and the fluid realm. But in this instance, it's a negative thing. It's neither here nor there. She is in effect bound. Now, the ground or the water are very important in your readings. You can see there is the security of solid ground with the 5 of Wands. There's the potential of movement, or you could look at it from an emotional point of view. You are very much in the realm of the emotions. Look for the liminal space in your readings. What does that signify? In the case of the 8 of Swords, it's not necessarily a good thing. Maybe she's in that space where she's on solid ground, but she's also having to connect with the turbulence of her feelings. Who knows? But plenty of potential for reading that landscape. Rivers and streams. A flowing stream or a river shows movement from one destination to another, just like a road. Whereas a road you will travel along, a river or a stream will carry you along. So rivers and streams, freely flowing waters within geographical containment. There is very much a beginning and an end. Here we go. Roads and pathways. So in this instance, we have temperance to the left and the moon to the right. Now, whenever a road or a pathway appears in the reading, you know that your route is laid out for you. Now, this is different from the prospect of being in a boat or being swept along a river or a stream. That forward movement is to a great extent out of your control. With a road or a pathway, it's very much in your control. You have the choice whether to follow it or not. But it does mean that if a road or a pathway appears in the landscape of one of the cards in your reading, there is guidance that has been very clearly laid out for you. Now, that can be guidance to or guidance from, and we see both examples in these two cards. You can see in the Temperance card, it's very likely that the pathway is coming from the mountains and the rising sun, leading towards the pool. Possibly the angel has taken that path. It very much feels as if the pool is the culmination of the path in the Temperance card. Whereas in the opposite way, when you look in the moon, you can see that the crayfish is embarking on the journey along the path. So the path is very much leading out of the pool, towards the cliff edges in the distance, and towards the moon. But whichever way, the route has been preordained. So we've had pathways and roads. What about bridges? Now, bridges are a means of connection and reconciliation. They basically allow us to cross an impossible gap. You can see in the case of the Five of Cups, the bridge is actually crossing a river. So the bridge in the Four of Wands is a little more ambiguous. We can't see what it's crossing, but what we do see is that there are people on one side of the bridge celebrating, and on the other side of the bridge there are more revelers who are waiting to come over. So the bridge on the Four of Wands is very positive. The bridge on the Five of Cups allows us to escape. It gives us a way out of the negative. So bridges are an overcoming of obstacles if they appear within the landscapes of your reading. They're going to allow you to bridge a chasm that you would otherwise have not been able to cross. As I say, they're a means of connection, they're a means of reconciliation. So a really important thing to look at in the landscape of our readings. Architecture, buildings. Now, we've got the ultimate piece of architecture on the left. We have the tower. On the right, I've chosen the Six of Cups because I think this really illustrates the point very well. Architecture in the tarot depicts status and levels of security. Now, we see that negatively on the left-hand card in the tower. Now, it very much represents security, but the wrong type of security, because the tower is very much the archetypal prison. Now, you can see it's being blasted open here. The tower also represents false senses of security. It's security that we've built up around ourselves on very shaky ground, or security that needs to be blasted open. We can see the divine bolt of lightning destroying the tower in the left-hand card. Positive security, though, is very much shown in the Six of Cups, because we see, in effect, home and church, and you can see children in a medieval courtyard. It's a very idyllic scene. So, in effect, these buildings provide prosperity, familiarity, security, and once again status. So look at the buildings within the landscape of the cards you've chosen, because they will tell you very much about your own environment and status and security, but also possibly of the people around you as well. Now, talking of buildings, one key thing to look at within the landscapes of our cards: are we indoors, are we outdoors, or, like we saw with the Eight of Swords, are we in that liminal space in between, half in, half out? So we've got three examples here. We are very much indoors with the Three of Pentacles. We see the interior of the church. We see the architect, the craftsman, and the monk or the priest. This is an indoor scene, and again, as we've said with the Tower, indoors represents security, the safety of four walls, the coziness of four walls, the prosperity and the strength of four walls. Now, there's something altogether more exciting and riskier on the outside. We can see that very much with the Ace of Swords. Indoors represents a contained view, a limited view, whereas outdoors gives us the potential for infinite perspective. And again, you can see this very, very well illustrated with the Ace of Swords, where we're actually looking from quite a high vantage point. We're looking down on a mountain range. And of course, you can see again that impossibly large divine hand wielding the sword of victory, of reconciliation, of peace, all of those good things. Now, in between, I've picked the Justice card because that's an interesting one. We can see pillars, which are very much architecture, but there is no wall behind these pillars. There's a curtain, a veil. And behind that veil, we can see the hints of a yellow sky. So, is this a courtyard that opens out onto a wider landscape? Let's use our imagination. What's behind that veil? Is it the garden of the magician with its yellow sky? Is it the kingdom of the realm of pentacles with its yellow sky? If we took the veil down, would we see the strength maiden, the lion, in a green landscape behind? So much potential. But it also brings the best of both worlds. There is the safety and the security of a contained environment, but there is also a window onto a wider world. So moving on from architecture, from indoors and outdoors, let's look at the wider picture of towns and cities, because we see this as a backdrop in a lot of the Waite Smith landscapes. Towns and cities are the epitome of civilization. They're the epitome of cooperation, and they're the epitome of community. Now, the key thing when we see a background of a town, a city, anything like that, no one person could have achieved that. That took a lot of people to build. It took all sorts of skills, a diversity of crafts to be able to create that artificial landscape. You can see from these examples here, again, there is the inference of prosperity, strength, power. Strength in numbers, I would say, is the key to this backdrop. There is a security in numbers. Many of us find security, it's strange because, there is the joy of living in a rural environment, but very often there is also the increased joy of living in a city with all that that can offer, and that melting pot of skills, talent, diversity, and all of those wonderful things that city living can bring. So civilization, cooperation, and community, strength in numbers, if you find yourself in this landscape. Walls. Now, we've touched on this, but walls specifically are a protective boundary. And once again, are you on the inside or are you on the outside? Now, one or the other is not necessarily good or evil. In this instance, I've picked two cards that kind of, certainly the card on the left turns the concept of outside on its head, whereas the one on the right shows outside as something very negative. On the left, outside is positive. We can see the child on the horse waving the flaming banner, emerging joyously from what looks like a walled garden. So in this instance, being outside is a place of growth and progression. Now, by contrast, on the Five of Pentacles, we see a situation where being on the outside is about as negative as it can get, because we can see the light shining through the church window, but we have a leper and a crippled beggar in the snow and in the cold outside. So in this instance, being on the outside represents exclusion. Now, walls, protective boundaries. Look, if you see a wall within the landscape of a card in your reading, first ask yourself, am I inside or out? And then, most importantly, is that good or is it bad? Now, here's an interesting one that's actually, I think, virtually unique to the Waite Smith. In the landscape of the Waite Smith Tarot, Pamela Coleman Smith was an accomplished stage designer and miniature theatre designer. Now, curiously, she incorporated stages as a landscape into many of her cards. Rachel Pollack coined the term stage cards for these. Now, this creates a very interesting landscape because not everything is as it seems. I didn't notice these until they were pointed out to me. But what you have is a flat stage in the foreground. So the protagonist in the card is very much an actor in a theatre. Now, the landscape in the background, rather than being real, is implied as a painted backdrop. So what this means is that whenever you have the theatrical stage as your landscape, what looks like outdoors is indoors, and then what looks like a primary experience is actually a secondary experience. So rather than experiencing that landscape, you are on a stage doing two things. You're creating an illusion of that landscape. So you've got to ask yourself, is what I'm seeing fully true, or are there hidden agendas? But also, you're actually inviting people to experience that landscape in a circumstance where they couldn't ordinarily experience it. And you're inviting them to sort of meditate on that environment in an abstract way. Now, isn't that what theatre does? Theatre takes us into an enclosed space and creates the illusion of being somewhere bigger. So there are positives and negatives with the stage cards. And I think you need to ask yourself all of those kind of questions. If you find that one of the landscapes in your reading is a stage, so it's a secondary experience rather than a primary experience. On a negative level, it's an illusion. On a positive level, it's a dream and an aspiration that you can invite yourself and others to step into. So they're the basic elements that I invite you to look at in the landscapes of your cards when you're doing a reading. No doubt, when you start looking more closely, you will find your own. They're the key ones that I always identify with. Now, we touched earlier on about the cards and the landscapes of the cards being connected, about the landscapes of the cards being the same landscape or snapshots of the same landscapes from different perspectives. Let's have a look at some of those pairings of cards where we can view it as the same landscape. Some of these we've seen already. So here we are again with the Fool and the Hermit. We've seen this pairing before, and as already said, we're in the same landscape. The Hermit stands atop of the very same mountains, possibly, that we see behind the Fool. Note the different sky colour. So this is roughly the same place, but a different time of day. The Fool is in the mountains in a figurative daytime, that place of mental and spiritual enlightenment and revelation. The Hermit, by contrast, is standing on top of those mountain peaks in the twilight. He is within the time between times, dusk and dawn. Again, it's a time of spiritual revelation, but in a different way. The Magician and the Ace of Pentacles. Now, the two things in common here are roses and lilies. Is this a scene from the same garden? I think possibly yes, it is. But again, look at the sky colour. Once again, with the Magician, we're in that figurative place, the yellow sky, to represent mental clarity, mental and spiritual enlightenment. The grey sky, by contrast, hangs over the garden of the Ace of Pentacles. So there is no sun, there is no bright light, but the bright light is introduced through the divine hand, bringing the pentacle into that scene. But we are, in effect, in the same garden, the same blooms. So we have the same language of flowers and the same symbolism. The purity of the lily, the white lily, and the passion of the red rose. Now, here's an interesting one for me. And it's not a connection that I immediately made. But once again, I feel that with the High Priestess and the Six of Swords, we're in the same landscape. The High Priestess is liminal. We can see the pillars of the temple, but again, you are looking through the pillars, through the gaps in the veil to the outside. And what I feel that you're looking at is the same water, expanse of water that we see in the Six of Swords. Have a look at the landscape in the distance of the Six of Swords. And if you look very, very closely between the gaps of the High Priestess card, you can see a similar landscape on the other side of the water. So doesn't that give us a different perspective on the Six of Swords? That boat is journeying across the very same waters of unknowing that we see behind the High Priestess's veil. Now let's look at the Lovers and the Sun, gardens. We are possibly looking at two secluded gardens, or possibly even the same garden under the same midday sun. See, on the left, we have the legendary Garden of Eden, the Tree of Life, the Tree of Knowledge. On the right, we have a Garden of Innocence almost, a walled garden. You can see the sunflowers peeping over. You see the baby on horseback riding out of that garden triumphantly. So is it the same garden? We can't be certain, but I would say that in a reading, the same rules here apply. And there's a lot of commonality between these two cards. Both represent gardens under the full light of the midday sun. Note the same sky colour by and large, but you can see, interestingly, a little detail that's not always picked up on. Have a look at the sun card and you can see hints of grey clouds clearing away beneath the sun. That's something that you don't see on the Lovers card. Let's look at some liminal space. It's interesting here. We have grey skies, but what you can see is either sunrise or sunset on both of these images. Now, this is very ambiguous. We don't see the deep dusk sky that we see in the Hermit, but we do see the late stages of a sunrise or the early stages of a sunset. Maybe that sun is peeking out beneath a canopy of clouds as it goes down or comes up. Who knows? But it's interesting because that rising sun or setting sun connects these two cards. And interestingly, they are connected within the sequence of the major arcana. The time between times. that in-between space. Both of these cards represent the in-between. Death is a transition. Temperance is the in-between of the two cups. You know, water pouring backwards and forwards between the two cups, maybe two alchemical cups, who knows? That balance of fire and water, fire on the breast of the angel in the triangle, the sun on the crown of his head, and yet his foot's in water. So that sunrise or sunset within the landscape is a very, very significant detail. We know that we are in the time between times. To be on the inside or the out. So here we are again with two cards that we've seen before, but I've put them together this time. This is very blatant in the symbolism. Are we on the inside or the out? On the left, we have the prosperity and the affluence inside the church, a highly skilled stonemason, an architect, and a priest. But then I'm convinced this is the same church. I mean, after all, we're in the same suit. Look what's going on the outside. It's a very different scene. It's dark, it's cold, it's snowing. And we see once again the leper and the crippled beggar. So there might be warmth, security, cooperation, interaction, friendliness on the inside. Look what these people are missing on the outside. So whether you're within the walls or out of the walls, outside of the walls in a reading makes a big, big difference. But these cards are connected. They are the same church in my eyes. Now, it gets really interesting when we start looking at the court cards, because what I want to show you here is how all four of these court figures are inhabiting the same landscape, but they're showing a big progression. And that progression symbolizes what's going on in their personalities. Now, look at the page. It's a stage card. So he's watching the fish jump out of his cup, which is representing his emerging emotional life. It's also a symbol of adolescence and puberty. But you can see the waters are behind him, but they're a stage backdrop. He hasn't experienced them yet. It's a concept. Whereas move forward to the night, and you see those waters as a flowing river. So the night is inland, but his emotions and his development and growth are flowing out towards the sea. Forward to the Queen. She is that incredible connecting and reconciling figure in that liminal space between the land and the sea. Her robes are actually made of water and flowing into the sea. Her feet are almost touching the sea, but she is enthroned on land. But in effect, we're at the mouth of the river, the estuary, and the seafront. Move forward again to the King. Now, he is right in the thick of the stormy waters, but as a mature figure, just like the Queen, he has the ability to rise above those waters. So he is in the water, but slightly above it, surrounded by the water, but in control of it. What a wonderful progression. And once again, they are in the same landscape, but interestingly, look at the colours of the sky. Grey skies on the page, but once again, that is part of the backdrop. But isn't it interesting that the King, rather than being in full daylight, is under a grey sky? And I think this says a lot about who he is, because there's a clash of his position as a king and having to maintain slightly aloof, objective stances. But at the same time, kings are represented by the element of fire, but this king is in the element of water. Fire and water don't mix. So you have that potential for a volatile, erupting personality. But then that grey sky reflects the fact that he has to rise above that, and he is on his floating plinth. The devil is in the detail with these cards, and that's what I love about them. So I hope from that you can see just how much these landscapes are really connected. I want us to move on finally to putting that into action through this card spread that I've devised. Now, I call this My Journey Through the Kingdom. Now, I have to thank a friend here because this is a reading that I did for a friend. We photographed it to keep a record of it because it was just so interesting, and they've graciously allowed me to share this, albeit anonymously. Now, this reading was basically to answer questions about a new relationship, and it was a new relationship that was proving to be a bit of a rocky ride. So we wanted to examine some of the things that were going on and the dynamics that were going on underneath that connection. So bear in mind that as we go through these cards, the landscapes are just as key as the figures, and I'm going to be paying special attention to the landscapes here. So card number 1, bottom left, is our significator. Now, we picked this deliberately. We chose the Two of Cups very deliberately because it was representing the onset of a relationship. Now, have a look to the right of that. I've got a set of 3 cards, number 2, 3, and 4. Now, we're going to look at this and call them, we're basically viewing this in the context of progress so far on a personal level. So, what we drew here, again, these were drawn deliberately to actually track how he saw the relationship had panned out so far. So, the High Priestess was chosen because this was a relationship that was very much going to take him into the unknown. So we are very much relating to the landscape behind the veil. Unfamiliar waters, slightly uncomfortable. Now, progressing through, we see the connection that we had before. Now, this is a connection that we discussed and again was chosen deliberately. That voyage across the waters behind the High Priestess's veil. Now, look to the right of the boat, the rocky waters, and the smooth waters to the left and ahead of the boat. Now, that's why my friend chose the Judgment card for card number 4, because he picked up on something on the landscape. If you look at the Judgment card, you can see the same rocky waters that are behind and to the right of the boat in the 6 of Swords. Now, we chose this because of the dead rising from the waters that you see in the traditional Judgment imagery. Now, he related to this very specifically. As he journeyed forward in this relationship, it was bringing some very uncomfortable skeletons out of the closet for him personally. And a lot of his insecurities were being revealed to himself. So, having put those 3 cards in place alongside the significator of the Two of Cups, we've looked at the landscapes, and it's actually the connection between the landscapes that's saying everything about what's going on in him. Let's move to the row above. Now, the next 3 cards were cards we picked as normal, face down and at random for the reading. Now, you can see here I've numbered those 6, 7, and 8. The reason being that card number 5 I've put at the end of the reading. Now, that's almost like a reverse significator. Again, we picked that one just normally face down, but this I've numbered where I need to be. So in effect, for my friend, when we were doing this reading, we drew this card, and that basically showed what he needed to be, where he needed to be, and what he needed to achieve. Now, this was not a comfortable card because for card number 5, he drew the devil. So let's look at that. Black background, night, darkness, and this immediately reverberated with him, and he connected it to the uncomfortable skeletons being risen, in the Judgment card, and it said it all. He needed to face his own internal fears and insecurities and the things that he was clinging to for security. In effect, this relationship was actually challenging him to do some shadow work and deal with his dark side if he wanted to make the relationship work. So let's look at 6, 7, and 8, because they're the cards he drew at random, and they're the ones that are showing the voyage that he needs to take. Now, look immediately at card number 6, this Two of Swords. And again, look at the sky. It doesn't always show up very clearly on some printings of the Rider-Waite, but we're in liminal space again. This is not the pale blue of full daylight. We can see the waxing moon representing tension rising over a slightly uneasy sea. This is not calm waters, but it's not rocky waters either. Now, that sea, again, let's relate it to the waters of the High Priestess, the waters on the Six of Swords, but it is not smooth. It's not as rocky as on the Judgment card, but what it shows is that the waxing moon is causing tension, and it's pulling the waters in a tidal way, maybe. We see the blindfolded woman on the stage. Again, let's look at this. It's a stage card. So the waters, the waxing moon, it's a backdrop. It's basically the card of denial, the card of seeing what you don't want to see. But again, it's on that stage, and the potential is for tension. You know, the potential is for uneasiness. The potential is for rocky waters. So the first thing that he has to do is take the blindfold off, turn around, look at that backdrop, and look at the potential situation that he's in, and all the uneasiness that brings. Card number 7. The Page of Wands. Immature, fiery, tempestuous. In a desert landscape. There's architecture here. There's pyramids. Big monuments. But this is a barren landscape, and this is the page. And he immediately identified with the more negative aspect of the page, because the first thing he said is that, yeah, there's a growing up process to happen here. So, but also that barren landscape, that desert landscape, is a very lonely place. So maybe these issues that he needs to face, maybe these shadow issues that he needs to face, are actually keeping him isolated, and are one of the reasons why he's holding those two swords in equilibrium and staying blindfolded. In effect, he's in that desert landscape and he's alone because of the things he needs to face. Card number 8, the moon. It's the third step, and the next landscape to step into is that journey of the crayfish. All of those subconscious fears within the pool of the unconscious actually have to come to the surface and walk the path towards the moon and towards integration. And basically, he has to face himself. And then here we are again with that final card, the Devil. He's facing the dark side. So there we are, a simple 8-card reading, but one that shows the potential of what we can do just by focusing not just on the people in the cards, but also on the background of the cards.